Good afternoon. This is Adrienne Payne-Andrews, and I would like to welcome you to the Kansas Health Foundation's Healthy Communities Initiative webinar, Targeting Your Audience. Today's webinar will focus on identifying target audiences, current successes and barriers to engaging them, and how to start shaping messages to reach them. On the line today are Jeff, Sean, and Elisa with Kansas Health Foundation, Tami, Bradley, and Vera Bothner, co-owners of Bothner and Bradley Incorporated, and Vicki James with Healthy Kids Challenge. Tami and Vera will begin the discussion with a slide presentation and will allow time at the end for questions. During the last 30 minutes, from about 1 to 1:30, Sean will facilitate additional discussion and networking time. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping reminders. All of your lines are muted. If you have not keyed in your audio PIN shown after joining the webinar, please do so, as that allows your line to be unmuted later for the networking portion of the call. If you have a question, please type it into the box on the right side of your screen. Jeff will read the questions for Vera and Tami to respond to at the end of their presentation. Finally, the webinar is being recorded and will be archived on SharePoint by next week. Thank you. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jeff.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Adrienne. I think we have a real treat today. Tami, Bradley, and Vera Bothner with Bothner and Bradley are with us to talk about strategic communication and policy and how to target your audience. Many of you may remember that Vicki had prepared a survey, and we got a lot of feedback saying that there was a need for thinking about targeting audiences and how to communicate with both organizational leaders, policymakers, and the community at large. Tami and Vera have a great background around communications. In fact, Tami was, when I first came here to the foundation, she was the Vice President of Communications, and she worked on a lot of our media campaigns that many of you will recognize, the Take It Outside campaign, Take a Second, Make a Difference. And Vera Bothner was at the agency that helped us develop those messages, and then came and acted as like a full-time consultant for the foundation for a number of years. So they have a great deal of experience not only thinking about how to move and develop communication strategies to help us move policy and behavior in communities, both at a statewide level and at a local level. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tami and Vera.
Thank you, Jeff. We are really pleased to be a part of the team and to be able to work closely with you again and the rest of the folks. We are here to talk about strategic communications and policy and targeting your audience. We have had the opportunity to take a look at the survey that was done, and we realized that there are a lot of challenges that can be addressed through some thinking about communication strategies. Clearly, awareness and messaging are two important aspects of that. We're also familiar with the community change model, and as we've been looking at that and reacquainting ourselves with it, we realized that communication is really integrated in all pieces of the community change model. So we'll be talking a little bit about the various pieces today, and it's going to be a very broad overview because we're really excited to be able to think about working with each of the communities almost individually as we move forward. Vera and I are going to turn this back and forth to each other. It's going to be very informal, and we're going to be looking forward to taking your questions at the end.
This is Vera, and as Tami said, we are very excited to be part of this, partly because we do this work right alongside with you. We've got several clients we work with that are actively engaged in how do you get change. And I'll just tell you right now, there's no easy answer. And so the beautiful part about what we're going to talk through today is it's hard. It's hard work. It's messy work. We love it most days. There's some days we don't love it. But we're right with you, and we're excited to talk about it both broadly and then at some point very specifically, because one of the things we've learned over time is one issue is one issue, one community is one community. There are some best practices, but at the end of the day, they're all still a little different, and their paths are very different.
With that, we're going to go to the first slide and looking at what your goal is. And the thing about working in the policy arena is you have usually a very specific and measurable goal. You're either making progress toward that, you've achieved it, it's very outcome-oriented, and we often refer to a quote that you'll see at the bottom of the slide, that the greatest problem in communication is the illusion that it has been accomplished. And oftentimes we find ourselves in that situation when we're working in other areas that are a little less defined. But with policy, again, it's a clear goal, and you know whether you're getting there or not. We also are going to talk about some very specific, very easily defined categories, the who, what, and how when it comes to strategic communication and targeting your audience.
It's interesting, too, because we are going to take these in an order. It is much more circular than it is linear. But in all honesty, you cannot determine the how until you determine the who. And we're going to talk through that. So we're going to spend a lot of slides on the who.
And that's where we are with this next slide. You really need to think about identifying them, listening and learning about your audience, and then giving some acknowledgement or understanding what the noise and competition is out there. And when you're looking at healthy eating and active living types of policy goals, there's a lot of competition and a lot of noise, and I'm not telling you anything new, but those are the elements that we're going to be talking about.
One of the things on this one, and one of the things that we really like about the community change model is that in some ways your who is both nicely targeted depending on what your policy initiative is, and also nicely broad. And that may seem counterintuitive, but it's really not. You've got your organizational decision makers, you've got your government policy makers, and then you've got the public. And as you all know, those both interweave and are discrete. And so this gets to the next slide, which I love it when Tami does this, because Tami always pulls me back to you've got to start with the inner circle. I sometimes get really excited when we're meeting with the client and start talking about, it can be a nonprofit and they're talking about something that we want to go do, and her question always is, okay, your employees have to be on board first. In your particular case, it's your coalition members. You have to have that really strong coalition, which I know there's been a lot of support and help in having you build that. We work with a lot of coalitions. Coalitions are, again, wonderfully messy and most of the time wonderful fun. But sometimes it takes a lot of effort to get even your coalition members on the same page. We're working with one right now that is so all over the board that it is going to take a fair amount of time just getting them on the same page, and that's before they can even go out to then talk to other policymakers, be they business policy or government policy.
I was going to talk a little bit about a project I was involved in actually as a volunteer. So I got to see the coalition and the work that it was doing from the outside in rather than the inside out, which is often where we're working. And it was just such a great case study, and it's an ongoing one. And it's the Wichita Bicycle Master Plan. And I know the folks from Wichita-Sedgwick County are familiar with that. But I think they did a great job of organizing the coalition, sharing information, getting people excited about the prospect, and then reaching out to the broader audience. And those are what the concentric circles here show, is that you don't work on one at a time. They're often, and most of the time, have to be things that you're working on simultaneously. But getting that organizational part of it done allowed for the other part to be done, I think, extremely well, and it actually has resulted in a very significant plan here for our community, and may even result in some funding opportunities to get some work done here. So,
one of the important things also about these circles is your circles may look different. This is a This is a general big picture idea of how you think about the who. Your who may look very different. Likely the coalition will look similar, but you may not need the voters in the general public as much as you need a city planner. You may need a group of business owners. And so your circles are going to look very, very different. And that is important because, again, every path is different. There are some times when it is much better to be not out in front of the general public all that much. If it's something that can get done without a lot of public discussion, sometimes that's the best. Sometimes it's better to have lots of public discussion. So you keep your goal very much in mind, knowing that your who is going to look different than the community next to you, and it's all based on your community and what your policy issue is.
One example of that, again here locally in Wichita, that I think has been a tremendous success is involved Jeff and Mim and others involved in the Health and Wellness Coalition. But a few years ago when that was getting off the ground, policy was discussed, and the immediate reaction was to think we needed to go to elected officials. And Mim was very savvy and really worked a lot behind the scenes with the city planners because she made just a great observation. We may talk a different language, but we are all headed the same direction. And with that, I think they were able to really identify some wonderful common policy outcomes and work together. And again, that was more behind the scenes, which, like I said, often allows things to stay out of the political realm.
And in another example, we had an issue that did require a vote. And in this particular case, it was a pretty significant vote. I know you will not be lobbying directly. In this particular case, we did have to have business leaders who drove that. And we did need a lot of media coverage to help educate the public about why that policy change was so critically important. So again, every path is a little different. They all still involve the same elements. It's a matter of how you put those elements together.
Now we're going to transition to still talking about the who, but the listening and learning part of this. And we could go on and on. This could be a whole workshop in and of itself about how to listen to various target audiences. But I will say that I'm sure everyone on this call already holds a great deal of knowledge about the folks they're working with or who they're trying to educate about policy goals. There are very formal ways to listen. There are things like focus groups and individual interviews and observations and surveys online and by phone still. But I will say that just stepping back and thinking, what do we know about who we're trying to talk to or organize, just often gives you that little bit of advantage of understanding where they're coming from. Vera just mentioned the business community, and they come at things at usually a much different angle than some of the folks in the nonprofit world. They're very bottom line driven, and they want to know what they need to know and what they need to do and then move on. And those kinds of aspects really are helpful whenever you're thinking about how to draft the messages.
One of the things with listening, and it is so critically important, is you've got to be very intentional about it. We've come to really love the word intentional. There are a lot of times that at the very first of a project, we kind of assume, but we never trust ourselves, that we know what other people are thinking. And sometimes we're right, a lot of times we're wrong. And especially with these types of issues, in all honesty, the less you talk and the more you listen to those closest to the issue, the more information you gain to understand how to eventually link your issue back to them. Individual interviews are an amazing thing. Sometimes you can't do them yourself because you're too close to the issue. It is amazing what people will tell you when you sit and listen. In fact, Jeff and I were actually just talking recently about an event he was at, that there was a reporter at, and there was a city council person at, and he listened. It's also interesting. It is very, very ongoing. Most of these projects take a long time. The one I mentioned before was a six-year trek. It is an ongoing process because what they think in year one may be very different than what they think in year two. You actually start to know you're getting there when you start to hear your messages kind of starting to be repeated back to you. But that takes listening because you really have to know where people are and you have to meet them where they are. If you try to go to the end of the conversation, they get confused, they shut down. You have to know where to start the conversation, and especially because so much of this work is one-on-one relationships, you may be starting that conversation at different places, which makes for a whole other interesting challenge.
I'm going to jump on the aspect of meeting people where they're at. We've had the opportunity to work with county commissioners here in Sedgwick County, but also across the state on a couple of different projects and go out and listen and learn. It's always an educational process. But in the last year, we've been very closely tied to a project that involves public health administrators and county commissioners. And we actually spent about a year utilizing meetings and discussion times to try to understand what county commissioners know about public health, and more importantly, how they would like to be communicated to, or what they'd like to know about public health. And it was interesting because even in our work group we had, we would get about 5 miles down the road of thinking that county commissioners need to know about A, B, and C, and realize that we needed to just back up all the way to understand the fact that there are new commissioners who almost literally know nothing about public health, to those who have even been in office for a while and may know a little bit but don't quite understand it. So it's just that tension between thinking we know all the answers sometimes and then reeling it back and saying, well, we need to really remind ourselves where people are at, what they're able to listen to, and then what will move the discussion forward. And I'm going to come back to some examples from that project here in a little bit.
You know, one of the ways to think about that too is anytime I start to go too deep into the weeds on anything, I ask myself, my husband's a banker, so I pick on bankers a lot. I ask myself, how much do I really want to know about banking? And the answer is not much. I really just want to know that, you know, my money's safe, that it's a conservative institution, that they're making good decisions, and that they're going to be there when I need them. That's a very simplistic example, but what people don't want to do, and so ask yourself, as you start getting into the weeds, you've got to know the weeds. We've got it. Bankers have to know the weeds, but we don't want to hear it as their customers. And so part of this is always knowing we're going to have more information. And I actually think, and we'll get to this in messaging, I think the hardest part, I know it's the hardest part for me, is making myself share less and not more with particularly decision makers.
Just in conclusion on the listening part, be a good listener. Your ears will never get you in trouble, and that's something we just sort of live by. Still talking about the who, we said we'd talk a little bit about competition and noise. And as I said earlier, in the policy areas you'll be working in, there is a lot of both. So finding a way to understand that and then target your message and deliver it in ways that will get to the right audience is what, you know, strategic communication is all about.
And so you think about that. I mean, let's skip policymakers for a while. Let's look at just a business CEO. So someone who is, I was going to pick an insurance company, but let's not do that. That's really a lot of just confusion and noise right now. Think about a small manufacturing company and what they're having to deal with on a daily basis, and literally making payroll that Friday. They've got a lot of noise. and they've got a lot of noise from a lot of different places, a lot of business places as well as community places as well as internal. So how you can cut through that noise and that competition is vitally important and is linked to both being very as concrete as you can be about your message and knowing where it intersects their interest. And that's where, again, it comes back to the listening. So much of this is about relationships. A lot of the way to cut through the noise is people choose which messages to pay attention to, honestly, often, and you know this, by who's delivering the message. Even though we have all the social media in the world and emails and newsletters, at the end of the day, face-to-face is still the most effective for anybody who's in a decision-making situation. Think about the way you make decisions. When a trusted person comes to you and says, this is an important issue, you listen to them because they are a trusted person. So those relationships are critically important to cutting through that noise. In fact, probably the messenger, if you will, is maybe 90% of the solution, and the message is 9%, and the other 1% I think sometimes is just luck and timing. In fact, over the years, we've sat with lots of groups and specifically talked about how to reach either this person or that person, who is the best person to reach them to. And I laughed. I told Tami the other day, it really is relationship mapping. It's who can get to this person, who can get to this person, who can then get to the person we need to make the decision. And how do you kind of weave that map together? And that, by the way, that can be very hard to figure out. And in some ways, the smaller the town, the easier, and in other ways, the smaller the town, the harder, because everybody's so close. I come from a very small community in western Kansas. Tami comes from a slightly larger community in south central Kansas. We've lived in Wichita a long time, but we get that Wichita is a small, big city, just like Ashland is a super small city.
And I'll just throw in another example from the public health project we've been working on, and that was the ability to recruit county commissioners to be a part of the ongoing work in this project has been a challenge, and the people who've been working on it have done just what Vera was saying. They didn't call it this, but it was relationship mapping, where they said, okay, these are the group of county commissioners we really need to engage in this process. Let's start calling. And they'd start calling and then realize that they weren't necessarily the right person to make the ask. And so they'd have to determine who was that right person in the local county and go to them and explain the process. And it really has been a very long and I would say time-consuming process, but the results have been fabulous. I mean, it was with those personal connections that we've been able to recruit and have county commissioners attend a 4-hour meeting in the evening, which is pretty unusual, but we're engaging a lot of them on that project. It comes down to personal relationships.
And in many ways, then the general public is a larger version of that. Again, who's delivering the message still matters, and face-to-face is still great. If you can get in front of a group of Rotarians, having what seems like a dialogue, even though it's a presentation, that still is a great way to deliver it versus a newsletter or versus a story in the local paper. All of it's valuable. One of the things that we'll talk about when we get to the how is the frequency matters and where it comes from matters, and so you can't rely on just one. It's, again, this beautiful woven together effort, which is a community change model. It really does take all of it to get a community and even a nation, a country, where we feel very differently about something than we did a few years before.
So now we'll move on to the what, and this is where you continue your planning based on who you're targeting and your outcome. Then we start looking at the message, and this is where public sentiment really does come into play, and how we make all those circles sort of work together. So with the policy outcome, we always like to focus on action. What is it that you want people to do? Education is great. Education is part of the process, but just stopping at education doesn't get done what you need it to get done many times. So you look at whether you want them to spread the word, do you want people to advocate, do you want them to organize, and there are different stops along the way, and you, again, have to ask yourself, where are people at?
Right, and that really is, that's really where it's almost like for different groups, again, you're going to have different wants. So your coalition, you're going to want them to be the organizers and the advocates. With the general public, you may want them to support something. You may want them to attend something. You may want them to change a behavior. For policymakers or for business leaders, you may eventually want a policy change. And so then you have to look at, again, based on what you want them to do, what are the messages and the actions we can take to get them to do that?
And that's where you start developing your message, which this is Vera's creation, this diagram you see here, which I think is, I'm a little biased, but I think it's really, really good, and really tells how the message develops, then the story, and then the action.
You know, this, you hear people talk about message, and then you hear people talk about story, and it's almost as if they talk about them as two separate things, and they can't be. In fact, may I say, I just heard a perfect example of this morning while listening, very exciting stuff, to the Sedgwick County Board of County Commissioners this morning. And there was a, I can't remember if she's a lieutenant, a policewoman there who, this was actually just at the beginning, and it was just a nice little informal thing, letting them know that police camp was coming up. And she had a great short message of what it was and why it was important, and thanked the commissioners for their support, and perfectly ended with the story that brought it all together. The story is what people will remember. Your message kind of, you know, once it kind of gets internalized, they kind of will get the message. But if you have a message and not a story, it's not sticky. It doesn't stay with people. The other thing is this is completely rooted in social science research. There's a great study where they did a study where they looked at facts and stories, and it's actually was about a prison. And in both cases, they had the facts say the prison guard was, you know, prison guards were really nice, and the stories were that they were mean. And then they reversed that. The prison guards were really nice, and the prison guards were really mean, and the story was they were really nice. People only remembered the story. That's what moves people. So if you can come with a great message that then has the perfect right story, that is what will get it in people's head, and then they need to hear it time and time again.
I'll go back to the public health example, and the message that was developed out of listening and with some input from county commissioners themselves on this, a message was built around the idea that public health should be considered in a triangle in the same way and at the same level that public works and public safety are. So in a sense, you start visualizing this idea of public health, public safety, public works, and it really opened the door to more storytelling, where you could tell a story about public health and then equate it to a bridge that's needed in public works or some sort of ambulance situation in public safety. It really gave them equal footing to tell the story in a way that really made sense to the county commissioners. And in one case, it led to action in the fact that one county commissioner used that sort of triangle to run his campaign on last year, totally unintentional, without any endorsement from anyone associated with the program. But he found out it was a really, really effective way to let people know what county commissioners do, which when we think about it, not a lot of people give a lot of thought to that. So that's a story from the public health side of things. Now we'll move on to messages, which are
hard. Messages are hard. Tami and I were actually talking just this morning about a nonprofit that we've worked with over the past year, and I bet it took a solid 3 to 4 months of really digging into content, because if you don't have content, you don't have messages. And I think that's one of the hardest things for me. I want to get straight to the messages. You have to understand the content, and then once you understand the content, this is really hard. You kind of almost have to forget 90% of it in order to keep your messages simple enough that they can resonate, and then find that story. This nonprofit we worked with, I bet we worked on those messages and content for 3 months, and then we've been revising them ongoing for the last 9 months based on where we are in this particular cycle and this particular issue. We have multiple audiences on that one, just like you do, and in each audience we have absolutely followed, and I won't read these to you, you know, what's on the screen, but we've had to really, really work hard to get it down to a few. It is hard. And by the way, it's especially hard with people who care a great deal about this. In this particular case, we've had to say to the not-for-profit executive director, we know you are passionate, but you can't give them the fire hose. You've got to be brief, and you've got to get straight to the point, and you've got to make people feel. You remember that quote about it's all about how people feel, not about what they know. At the same time, you've got to be able to back it up, because there will be people who will question you. There will be people who want to know the case and want to get specific. So it's kind of like you've got to have multiple levels of messages. Here's the ones we lead with, and here's the ones we use if needed. And by the way, that once you have a message, be disciplined and use it over and over. I have a very hard time with that. I have to force myself not to start with a blank sheet of paper, but come back to it again and again. Every message also, every issue has a different starting point for the message. We worked on downtown issues for the last few years, and we had to start almost from scratch again with that, because it's been a while since it's been on kind of the community priority list, discussion list, if you would. So we had to back up and really start with the identification of why is this issue important before we ever got to the what do we need to do about it. We've done a lot in technical education over the years, and we had to do the same thing there too. Why is this important for the community, and therefore for business leaders and policymakers to be discussing this issue? Other things you can start more in the middle if they've already been part of the community conversation for a long time.
I'll give you an example of a project we worked on several years ago now, probably 6 or 7 years ago, called the Kansas Affordable Airfares Program. And that's not what it was called when we first started. There was a coalition that was organized, and our challenge was that we had airfares in our community that were becoming unreasonably high, and there needed to be some kind of subsidy. The city and the county had both been providing dollars to that point, but it really was becoming clear it needed to be in some way funded by the state. And that was controversial, and it wasn't necessarily something the business community all acknowledged and knew about, but we needed to get them on board. So we organized and we got them on board. We used various messages at that point to make the case. But then it became completely different once the conversation moved to Topeka. Wichita got behind it because it had a local impact, but when we took it to Topeka and the lobbyists up there started working the issue, boy, those people in Topeka didn't really care about it as much as we thought they should. So we came up with it is about affordable airfares for Kansas. There was a lobbyist working at that time who clearly pointed out the, I think he called it a death spiral, that we would be going in if we didn't start reversing this trend and losing businesses and all of that. But we had to come up with very simple, clear messages that made the case for policymakers who may not even like sending money to Wichita, let alone wonder why there was an issue to be discussed in the first place. We developed what are called palm cards with these very simple messages and maps on it that told the story.
You know, I think the most brilliant thing, and we won't take any credit for this, this was his. He developed a map. If there was one thing that worked, it was a visual. Now, of course, it's all the stuff surrounding that, but a visual that showed, and you know, many of you fly out of Wichita who are listening to the call, some of you do not. It was really interesting. He developed a map which they could, by a survey that had been done, show how much money people in each county had saved through having a low-fare carrier here in the Wichita airport. Because of that, you were able to say to folks in Dickinson County, yeah, you may be driving to Kansas City to fly out, or you may be driving to Wichita. And by the way, the Kansas City airport happens to be on the Missouri side. So one of the messages was, this is Kansas's largest airport, and if we don't have, and actually Tami and I gathered stories from Dodge City and from Hutchinson and from, you know, all sorts of communities. And again, those stories and that map were what made that message come alive. Without it, it was a message. With it, it became a compelling case.
So now we'll move on to the how, and we're going to look at resources, channels, and what Vera said earlier, the frequency and consistency, or the reach and frequency is sometimes what we call it as well. So we are going to talk a little bit about resources.
So I developed this slide because I think too often people think of staff as, well, it's just time. And in all honesty, staff are almost sometimes our biggest, well, they are our biggest cost. Because normally what we do for implementation, unless people do have more money, is pretty much staff-driven. So your biggest resource is how you spend your time. Then you also, whether it's a palm card or it's a newsletter or it's something, then you sometimes are producing things as well. This is how you determine what you can do how well.
So again, when it comes to frequency and consistency, you're focused on the who. You're going from complex to simple, and you're making the case relevant. We have done a fair amount of media training with folks, and what we find is that if you're able to train yourself to talk to the media, you may never have to talk to the media, but if you do, you're equipped, and if you are ready for that, then you can pretty much tell your story to any other audience that you need to. With our corporate training that we've done, it's remarkable how often people say, well, I may never need to talk to the media about this, but now I can go out and talk to my employees in a much more clear way about what we're doing and why we're doing it.
It is so true, and you know, I laugh. I tell every client we meet with that we're generalists. That's what Tami and I are. We're generalists. They are always specialists. They will always know more about their coalition's issues, their nonprofit organization, whatever they do, they're going to know more about it. They've got to figure out how to now talk about it to a generalist. News media are by definition, unless they're in a trade publication, they are by definition a generalist. We've all had that experience where they show up and say, tell me a little bit about your organization, tell me a little bit about your issue. So the more you can get that to being able to really talk about that in a very concrete, consistent, simple message plus story way, the better off you are. And there's all sorts of tips for that we can go into. I don't want to go into a lot of them now, but one of the things that's just really helpful that you might all tuck away, and that's the rule of 3. If you can say the 3 most important things are, or if you can say the 3 issues we're working with are, or the 3 solutions are, for some reason, and social science backs us up, for some reason we remember 3 things better than we remember 2 or 4. So that is just one of those nice little packaging tips as we're getting our messages honed.
And then again, this is our final slide on the how. Looking at the various channels to deliver those messages, it's going to be a combination of this, of these things you see here, from your website to the news media, which is earned media, to advertising if you have a budget to do that, and then working on those social media strategies, direct mail perhaps.
Yep.
Face-to-face, of course, has to be a part of the mix. And at various times and various ways, you will be working in all these areas. I read recently that says we truly do remember things we see in 2 or 3 different places. Even Facebook and Twitter reinforce messages that we may have seen in the newspaper or vice versa. So again, a combination of all of those, reaching people as many times as you can, as often as you can, and making sure you are consistent. You'll wear out of your messages long before any of your audiences will probably even know that you're talking about this. So that's
and when you look at this, and this is, you have to be where your audience is. And if you don't know where they are right now, that's part of the listening and asking. Because what happens is, if you are on Facebook, but the very people you're trying to reach are not on Facebook, you may have great things, but you're not reaching your who. So this is why you've got to figure out the who before you figure out the how. Now, you're going to have to do a multitude of them, because anymore, it used to be, I still remember when we thought it was very fragmented because there was cable in addition to broadcast stations. You're going to have to do a lot of these, because the more fragmented we get, the more fragmented our audiences are, and they're in different places. So some of it is just being particularly intentional about knowing who you're reaching and the best ways to reach them.
So that really concludes our formal comments today, and just to reinforce, it's the who, the what, and the how, targeting your audiences and developing messages and ways to reach them. So now I guess we'll turn it back over to Adrienne.
Thank you very much, Vera and Tami. I really appreciate the opening of this great discussion. Jeff, did you want to read off some of the questions?
Yeah, we have one question that's keyed up right now. And if any other questions come to mind from any of the participants, please go ahead and type those in. The first question is, what have been some of the most effective ways you have been able to communicate messaging and talking points to coalition members?
Oh, that is a really good question. Okay, my goodness, we're in the middle of a couple of these right now. You know, it really does take two, I'm doing this off the top of my head, but 2 things. And one is really being very consistent and writing them down for them, and then forcing them to say them out loud. I call it internalizing. Your coalition has got to internalize this message. Now, they've got to internalize it in their own way, but they've also got to be consistent enough that everybody recognizes it's the same message. So one of the groups we're working with right now, we've been working with over several months, and every time I put the same sheet of paper in front of them, and every time we talk through the same issues, and it's only with that practice of saying it out loud and being consistent over time can you really get people to own their message. We've got a different situation right now where we've got 2 top business leaders who a year ago, I think knew very little about an issue, and now they own it. I have been so impressed. They so get this issue. They don't get the depth of it. They don't get the specifics. They don't need to. They have now internalized this message.
And I'm helping a relatively new coalition get started and doing some planning with them, actually a couple of different coalitions. But mechanically, I think that meeting in person and then keeping people informed by email are really the most effective ways I've seen this work, especially in the infancy of a coalition. Again, I read recently where you need to pretty much feel like you're over-communicating in the early stages. It's back to relationships. It's building the trust that goes along with having people involved in any project. So mechanically, I think those in-person meetings that are scheduled ahead of time where you can share ideas and practice those messages, as Vera said, and then keeping people engaged and in touch through email that has worked.
I heard a national consultant once say, prepare 1/3 of the material and use it 3 times more often. And I think that goes, he was talking about news media, I think that goes for coalitions too. The ones we've been working with at the very beginning, because people have had their own lives between, we go back to, here are the 3 issues we're working on, and here are the, so you say it over and over and over again until you start hearing people say it back to you.
Okay, thanks. We got 2 more questions that came up. One, what are the best ways to collect stories? They seem to get lost or don't come along at the right time.
Yeah, that is a really hard one. I think stories are some of the hardest. First of all, you don't need as many stories as you think you might. So I would say really have 2 or 3 really good ones and use them over and over. It is amazing how many times you can tell the same story, and it's only, after people remember it, but they don't remember it, or they remember, oh yeah, that's right, that's the situation they're sharing. So I would say you really do have to ask. And some of the times we're so close to it we don't even recognize when a good story is literally right in front of us. So some of it is when you see people leaning in or perking up, even at a coalition meeting, that may be because there is a good story being shared. It's not easy work. I think we make it harder than it should be. I'm not a good storyteller. I'm not a good joke teller. Once I have a story, I use it a lot, and you have to practice it and practice it out loud, and just protect them because you just don't know when they're going to come along. But the more you're out listening to people and connecting, the more you will get them. It really does take listening.
Well, and Vera said to ask people to collect those. I'll be a little more direct, and I'll say you'll probably need to assign somebody.
Yeah.
That's the way it's worked in almost everything that's been effective in our world is you have to assign somebody to collect them and then find a way to put them on your website or file them away or something so that you have them when you need them. So that's
yeah, I might say Vera just said she didn't tell stories, but I think most of the people listening, you've been telling stories this whole webcast. I mean, you've illustrated specifically by telling a story or experience, and I think that's something oftentimes we forget, that we do communicate often by telling stories, and I think trying to really intentionally think about collecting them as a leadership team and as coalition members, I think I think it could be a very helpful kind of activity for your leadership team.
Okay, Jeff, that is so funny because you're right. I just did exactly what I said. They were staring right at me in the face, and I didn't even realize that. And you're right. You know what? I love to tell stories. I probably should have said I don't tell jokes very well, which I don't. And my husband can back that up. And part of that is I wing a lot of stories. I don't have them prepared and ready to go. The very best people I have worked with have them prepared and ready to go. When we were working with the nonprofit group on technical education, he would have stories from manufacturers, of which I bet about 80% of the story was true, and I bet about 20% was pretty embellished. But it would be a story that would illustrate his point, and I would go with him from meeting to meeting or group to group. He would tell the same story over and over and over again. And he had gotten it from listening to the businesses that he was trying to help with their skilled workforce.
Yeah. Another good story. So we have a couple more questions. What are some of the questions a coalition should ask itself to create the message?
Boy, that's a really good question. You know, I think one question would be who will this policy impact? And kind of start from that perspective, because I think it again is those stories and starting from that. Why are you doing this, and who is it really going to help, and why haven't we been doing it to begin with? Those kind of questions.
That is really good. That really gets to benefits and barriers, which is exactly what Tami always has us start with. So once you know the who is really going to benefit from this? How is it going to make their lives better? And conversely, and Tami just phrased it so well, why haven't we been doing it? And that's your barriers. What's standing in the way? And once you start, I will tell you, messaging sessions are very messy because everybody has a different point they want to make. So in some ways what you're doing is you really are throwing it all against the wall to see what will stick. And so being very specific about who is it going to impact, how is it going to help them, why haven't we been doing it now, who else will care, those are the things that you start with. And then once you have a really good, what I call kind of the larger case statement, you start narrowing. It's like an upside down funnel. You're only, or you know, the iceberg, if you want to use that analogy. You're only using the tip of the iceberg with most folks, but you have everything from those discussions that's just right there below the surface waiting just in case people need it.
Good. Okay, one more question. Do you have any advice on handling the need for corrections in earned media? I'm assuming that means that if someone has earned a story that there was some miscommunications or something. That's my assumption anyway.
That would be my guess too. Okay, the most important advice is pick your battles carefully. If it's something that is small, if it is a fact or a number and it's not relevant to the ongoing discussion, ignore it. If it is small, fact, number, date that is relevant to the conversation or the ongoing work, then that's pretty easy. I mean, really honestly, the reporters want to get things right on that stuff, the small stuff. So that is a nice quick phone call. I like phone calls when it is this because emails can be easily misunderstood. To the reporter, not to their editor, but to the reporter that simply says, hey, I usually take ownership. I may have miscommunicated or, you know, not sure how this happened, but it's actually X instead of Y. They want to correct that because especially if it's an ongoing issue, they will correct that in their database so that, which is all online now, we all see their database now, so they don't repeat it in future stories. Okay, that's the easy part, if it's easy. If it's tone, if it's content, if it's bigger than just a small fact, it's still pick your battles carefully. It's just a different kind of pick your battles carefully. If it's something that you can move past, it's still better to move past because if you can keep going or reorient the story later, it's just hard to have those conversations. If you can't move past it, then you're going to need to sit down with the reporter or whoever, you know, maybe a blogger, and you're going to have to listen. And this is the hardest thing to do because you're going to want to correct them from the get-go. You're going to have to listen and really listen to where they're coming from and then figure out if there is a way that you can get to a common understanding. If there is not, then it may be time to go up the earned media food chain, meaning to an editor. And that's always a very difficult, tricky situation, but it can be done.
Any more questions from the group? It doesn't look like we have any more questions. I think this has been great, Vera, Tami. I thought the overview was very, very good. I think it gives us some direction as we work individually with individual communities. So anyway, I'm getting distracted here.
Thank you, Jeff. We're really excited about what all the communities are doing.
And going deep into some of these areas as they need to.
Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Vicki.
Yes. Vera, Tami, thank you. If everyone is as energized from your presentation as I am, I think we're all excited to go out and put some of this into action. And this is a perfect example of this presentation was strategic communication to a targeted audience, to our leadership teams. And it was an excellent, excellent presentation, so we appreciate that. For teams, I just want you to know that this is not a first and last time with Vera and Tami. They've alluded to there will be opportunities to work individually with communities. They will be part of some of our convenings coming up, and so we're looking forward to them really helping us as we work through the community change framework and our policy with strategic communication. Just have a couple of updates and announcements. As you know, our second Wednesday of every month is when we spend this time together for networking and for broadening our education and our content understanding so we can create our message and build the story. And Mary and Natasha will be back with us August 14th, and their topic is really going to be, they are going to outline the legal technical assistance work and examples of what they are researching and doing for each of our HCI communities, because there is a lot of overlap, and they'll be able to help you see some of the resources they're developing and things they're putting together and some of the overlying themes that are happening in a lot of the community work. So join us August 14th for that. We also posted some new resources and events on SharePoint. Please be sure and check that out. For those of you that are the HCI1 Original 12 communities, there is a new discussion forum, and I would challenge you to participate in that. I've posted the question to ask each of the 12 original teams how you're using the semi-monthly tracking tool and any questions that you have and how to use that, so that that tool really informs your actions and helps you and your leadership team as you are moving forward. So please connect with each other on SharePoint in that discussion and share how you're utilizing the tool so it's really effective for you. Last, those of you that are interested in the Food Hub convening, which is going to be in Lawrence at the Fairgrounds August 28th and 29th, the agenda, yay, has been finalized, and registration information will be emailed out to you, whoever the contact is from your community leadership team. The registration will be emailed and in your inbox tomorrow. You can refer questions back to me, and we are so excited about the day-and-a-half program of local, state, regional, and national professionals that have been put together to really move this forward. And Vera and Tami are also going to be a part of that. So what you learn there, you can come back and be able to message and tell your story and move forward. So with that said, we're going to turn it over to Sean for our networking part of the call. We'll now stop recording,